The warrant was issued for a single individual at a single address. Apartment 4B in a mid-rise residential building located in a neighborhood that had seen better days but wasn't overtly dangerous. The building housed approximately 60 units spread across 6 floors. A mix of young professionals, families, and retirees. The kind of place where people knew their immediate neighbors but didn't pay much attention to everyone else in the complex. The investigation had been running for 7 months. It started with a missing person report filed by a woman's sister in another state. The woman had moved to the city for what she described as a job opportunity. She maintained regular contact for the first 3 weeks. Then communication stopped. No phone calls. No social media activity. No response to messages from family or friends. Local police investigated but found limited leads. The woman's last known address was a sublet arrangement that had ended weeks earlier. Her employer, a temporary staffing agency, had no record of her working any assignments after the first month. Bank records showed her account had minimal activity and then went dormant. The case would have gone cold, except that a similar pattern emerged 3 months later involving a different person. Then another. Then 2 more. All of them had moved to the city for work opportunities. All had maintained contact with family initially. All had gone silent within weeks of arrival. And all had some connection, however tenuous, to job placements or housing referrals that eventually traced back to online advertisements and communication with individuals who used multiple aliases and disposable contact information. Federal investigators took over when the pattern suggested interstate trafficking. Digital forensics on the communications revealed sophisticated operational security, encrypted messaging, burner phones, email accounts that were used briefly and then abandoned. But investigators eventually identified patterns in the digital fingerprints, certain writing styles, specific phrases that appeared across multiple conversations, and eventually, an IP address that wasn't properly masked during one communication session. That IP address traced to a residential building. Apartment 4B. The lease was held by a man with no criminal record, steady employment history, and no obvious red flags. Surveillance was established. The target was observed entering and leaving the apartment on a regular schedule. He appeared to live alone. No visitors were documented beyond delivery personnel and occasional maintenance workers. But digital surveillance told a different story. The IP address associated with Apartment 4B showed constant activity, file transfers, encrypted communications, access to websites and services consistent with someone managing complex operations. The bandwidth usage was far beyond what a single person living alone would generate through normal internet activity. The warrant was issued based on probable cause that the occupant was involved in trafficking operations, and that evidence of those operations would be found inside the residence. The tactical plan was straightforward. Execute the warrant during early morning hours when the target would likely be home and when building occupants would be less likely to interfere or be endangered by the operation. SWAT was requested because intelligence suggested the target might have access to weapons, and because the building's layout created tactical considerations. Multiple units on each floor. Shared corridors. Potential for civilians to be present in adjacent apartments during the entry. The operation needed to be controlled and precise. The team staged at 5:45 a.m. on a Wednesday. 14 operators divided into entry team, support element, and perimeter security. The building's main entrance was accessible through the front lobby. Apartment 4B was on the 4th floor at the end of a corridor. 2 possible points of exit: the apartment door leading to the hallway and a fire escape accessible through a window in the living room area. At 6:03 a.m., teams moved into position. Perimeter units secured the fire escape route. The entry team approached the apartment door. Standard knock-and-announce procedures. No response from inside. Hydraulic ram deployed. Door breached at 6:07 a.m. The apartment was silent. Lights were off in most rooms. The entry team flooded through the doorway and began clearing the space. The layout matched building records. Small kitchen visible from the entrance. Living room to the right. 2 bedrooms and a bathroom extending down a short hallway to the left. The target was located in the first bedroom. He was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed when operators entered. He showed no resistance. Hands were raised immediately. He was secured and moved to the living room while the rest of the apartment was cleared. The second bedroom changed everything. When operators opened the door, they found a space that looked nothing like a residential bedroom. The walls were lined with equipment racks holding computer servers, networking hardware, and data storage systems. 6 monitors were mounted on one wall displaying what appeared to be surveillance camera feeds. A desk in the center of the room held 3 laptop computers, all powered on and displaying active screens. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a command center. The surveillance feeds showed interior views of different residential spaces. One feed displayed a living room where several people were sitting on couches. Another showed a bedroom with multiple beds. A third showed what looked like a kitchen area. The feeds were live. Timestamps in the corners indicated current date and time. These weren't recordings. These were real-time surveillance of occupied locations. The team leader immediately called for digital forensics specialists and additional federal agents. What had been planned as a standard warrant execution on a single suspect had just expanded into something far larger. The target wasn't just involved in trafficking operations. He was actively monitoring multiple locations where people were being held. The suspect was read his rights and declined to speak without an attorney. The apartment was secured as a crime scene. Federal agents began the careful process of documenting and analyzing the equipment in the command center bedroom. The computers were running specialized software for managing surveillance systems, coordinating communications, and tracking individuals across multiple locations. One laptop displayed a database with names, photographs, and status entries. The entries included arrival dates, current locations, and what appeared to be assignment codes. There were 156 entries in the database. 156 people with names, faces, and location codes. Some entries were marked as archived with dates going back 4 years. Others were marked as active with recent timestamps. The surveillance feeds corresponded to location codes in the database. Investigators counted feeds from 7 different properties. Each feed showed spaces where multiple people were visible. The video quality was good enough to see faces clearly, good enough to count individuals in each location. Federal coordination began immediately. The 7 properties needed to be identified and rated simultaneously. If word reached anyone managing those locations that the command center had been compromised, victims could be moved or harmed. Evidence could be destroyed. The network could scatter and reform elsewhere. Investigators worked backwards from the surveillance feeds to identify the properties. IP addresses for the camera systems were logged in the computer files. Those IP addresses were traced to physical locations. Within 2 hours, all 7 properties were mapped. 4 were residential apartments in different parts of the city. 2 were houses in suburban areas. 1 was a converted commercial space that had been rezoned for mixed-use occupancy. Tactical teams were assembled for coordinated raids on all 7 locations. Federal agents from multiple offices were brought in to support the operation. The timing was critical. All entries needed to happen simultaneously to prevent any location from being warned by communications from another site. The briefing emphasized that these locations likely contained victims, not just suspects. Rules of engagement prioritized victim safety over evidence preservation. Medical teams and victim advocates were staged at each location. Translation services were arranged for multiple languages since intelligence suggested the victims represented various nationalities. At 11:47 a.m., 5 hours and 40 minutes after the initial entry into apartment 4B, coordinated raids began on all 7 properties. Each location was approached using tactical protocols appropriate to the specific building type and occupancy situation. Some entries were made through front doors. Others required more complex breach procedures. The first location was a 3-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a residential building similar to the one housing the command center. Entry team breached the door at 11:47 a.m. exactly. Inside were 23 people, 14 women and 9 men, ages ranging from late teens to mid-30s. They were in various rooms throughout the apartment. None appeared to be restrained, but all showed signs of fear and confusion when tactical operators entered. The apartment had reinforced locks on bedroom doors that could only be opened from the outside. The windows were covered with blackout material and secured with bars that prevented opening from inside. The space was configured to keep people contained while maintaining the appearance of a residential apartment from outside. The second location was a converted warehouse space. Entry was made through a side access door. Inside were 31 people. Living conditions were worse than the first location. Makeshift sleeping areas, minimal furniture, inadequate sanitation facilities. The surveillance camera was positioned in a corner of the main. The third location was a house in a suburban neighborhood. Entry teams approached expecting resistance but found the structure largely unoccupied. In the basement were 19 people. The basement had been modified with additional rooms created using temporary partition walls. Each room held 3 to 5 individuals. The basement windows had been sealed from outside. The only exit was through the main house, and the basement door had a commercial lock installed. Locations 4 through 7 followed similar patterns. Residential spaces modified to contain multiple people. Reinforced security measures that trapped occupants inside. Surveillance cameras providing live feeds back to the command center in apartment 4B. And people who had been living in these spaces for periods ranging from weeks to months. The total count across all 7 locations reached 141 individuals present at the time of the raids. The database in the command center listed 156 total entries, suggesting that 15 people were either no longer in the network, had been transferred elsewhere, or were at locations not yet identified. Medical teams began triage immediately. Malnutrition was widespread. Several individuals required hospitalization for dehydration, untreated injuries, or infections. Psychological trauma was universal. Many of the victims had been told that leaving would result in arrest, deportation, or harm to family members. Some believed they owed debts that had to be repaid through labor. Others had simply accepted their situation as permanent because they saw no possibility of escape or rescue. Victim advocates worked with translators to begin the process of identification and documentation. Spanish, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Russian, and several other languages were represented among the group. Many had entered the country legally on work visas or tourist visas that had since expired. Some were undocumented. A few were U.S. citizens who had been recruited through false job advertisements. The investigation into the network's operations revealed a sophisticated structure. The man arrested in apartment 4B was the technical coordinator. He managed the surveillance systems, maintained the databases, and handled digital communications with other members of the organization. But he wasn't the leader. He was middle management in an operation that involved dozens of participants across multiple levels. The surveillance feeds in the command center provided investigators with a roadmap. Video footage stored on the servers showed people entering and leaving the properties. Dates and times were logged. Faces were visible. Vehicle license plates were captured on exterior cameras. The suspect had been meticulously documenting the operation while simultaneously providing the evidence that would dismantle it. Additional arrests followed over the next 72 hours. Property managers who rented spaces to the organization knowing they would be used for confinement. Labor brokers who placed victims in exploitative work situations. Transport operators who moved people between locations. And several individuals who served as enforcers, ensuring that people in the properties remained compliant and didn't attempt escape. The financial investigation revealed the scope of the operation. Over 4 years, the network had generated millions of dollars through forced labor, debt exploitation, and fees charged to businesses that received workers through the placement system. The money moved through shell companies, cryptocurrency accounts, and international transfers designed to obscure the source and destination of funds. The 7 properties were seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. The equipment in the command center was cataloged as evidence. The computers contained years of records documenting the operation. Names, dates, locations, financial transactions, communications with collaborators, and surveillance footage showing daily activities at each property. For the 141 people rescued during the coordinated raids, the experience of liberation was complex. Relief at being freed from confinement. Fear about what would happen next regarding their immigration status or legal situation. Uncertainty about where they would go or how they would support themselves. And trauma from the experience of being controlled, exploited, and dehumanized by people who viewed them as inventory rather than individuals. Federal Victim Services coordinated with nonprofit organizations to provide immediate support, emergency housing, medical care, legal assistance for immigration matters, mental health services, job training programs that were legitimate, unlike the false opportunities that had drawn many victims into the network initially. The process of helping 141 people rebuild their lives required resources from multiple agencies and organizations, working in coordination for months after the initial rescue. The investigation also focused on how the network had remained undetected for 4 years. The properties appeared from outside to be normal residential occupancies. People seen entering or leaving didn't obviously appear to be victims. The network had been careful to avoid behaviors that would draw attention from neighbors or law enforcement. No loud disturbances. No visible security measures that would seem unusual. No patterns of activity that would trigger suspicious activity reports. The victims themselves had been coached on what to say if questioned by anyone outside the network. They were told to describe themselves as roommates sharing expenses. They were instructed to avoid drawing attention and to behave normally when outside the properties for work or supervised activities. The surveillance cameras allowed managers to monitor compliance and identify anyone who might be considering escape or disclosure. The system was designed for invisibility. It operated in plain sight within residential neighborhoods. It used spaces that looked ordinary from outside. And it controlled victims through a combination of document retention, debt manipulation, threats, and psychological conditioning that made them feel powerless to seek help. The break in the case came through persistence by family members who refused to accept that their loved ones had simply chosen to cease contact. Through investigators who recognized patterns across multiple missing person reports. And through digital forensics that eventually traced encrypted communications back to a physical location. If any of those elements had been missing, the network might have continued operating indefinitely. The 141 people in those properties would have remained trapped. The 15 individuals who had passed through the system and moved elsewhere would have remained lost. And the operation would have continued recruiting new victims to replace those who were eventually discarded or transferred. The timeline reconstruction showed the network had been operating for 4 years and 3 months. The earliest entries in the database dated back to the initial setup phase when only 2 properties were in use and victim counts were relatively small. Over time, the operation scaled up. More properties were added. More people were recruited. The database grew to 156 entries. The surveillance systems expanded to cover 7 locations. At the time of the raids, the operation was at its peak capacity. All 7 properties were actively housing victims. New recruitments were planned. The organization was profitable and expanding. There were no indications that it was preparing to shut down or relocate. The entry into apartment 4B at 6:07 a.m. interrupted that trajectory. The discovery of the command center revealed the network's scope. The coordinated raids at 11:47 a.m. liberated 141 people. And the investigation that followed dismantled an organization that had operated successfully for over 4 years, while exploiting some of the most vulnerable people who came to the city seeking opportunities to improve their lives. For the tactical teams, The operation evolved from a standard warrant execution to a large-scale rescue operation in the span of minutes. The bedroom filled with computer equipment. The surveillance feeds showing live footage from multiple locations. The database containing names and faces of over 100 people. All of it was unexpected based on the initial intelligence. The warrant was for one person at one address. The discovery revealed 7 properties and 141 victims. The investigation had focused on a single suspect. The arrest led to dozens of additional targets. The operation that began with a missing person report 7 months earlier ended with the dismantling of a network that had operated for 4 years. The man arrested in apartment 4B eventually accepted a plea agreement in exchange for cooperation. His testimony and the evidence from his computers provided investigators with detailed information about the network's operations, financial structures, and participant roles. His cooperation didn't absolve him of responsibility, but it expedited the process of identifying and prosecuting other members of the organization. Sentencing recommendations included significant prison time. The judge noted that while cooperation was considered, the defendant had been a critical component of an operation that had exploited and dehumanized 156 people over more than 4 years. The surveillance systems he managed had been essential to maintaining control over victims. His technical skills had enabled the operation to expand and persist. The trial for other defendants lasted months. Evidence included the surveillance footage, database records, financial documents, and testimony from victims. Convictions were secured against multiple participants. Some received sentences measured in decades. Others, whose involvement was more limited, received shorter terms. The 7 properties were eventually sold. The proceeds went to a fund established to provide restitution to victims. The amounts were modest compared to the harm suffered, but represented a symbolic acknowledgement of responsibility and provided some financial support for individuals rebuilding their lives. For the 141 people rescued that day, recovery continues. Some have successfully transitioned to stable employment and housing. Others continue to struggle with trauma, legal challenges, or difficulty trusting systems that previously failed to protect them. Victim advocacy organizations remain involved in providing ongoing support. The operation remains a case study in how trafficking networks can operate within urban environments using residential properties that appear entirely normal from outside. The scale of 156 victims over 4 years, distributed across 7 properties, all coordinated through a command center in a single apartment, demonstrated the sophistication and organization that can exist in modern trafficking operations. The apartment building where it all began has returned to normal operations. The occupants of apartment 4B moved out after the arrest. The unit has been renovated and re-rented. People living in the building now have no idea that for years, one of their neighbors was monitoring 7 properties where over 100 people were being held against their will. The investigation continues in some aspects. Efforts to locate the 15 individuals whose entries were marked as archived or transferred remain ongoing. Some may have left the network voluntarily, others may have been moved to locations not yet identified. And some may have been victims of outcomes that investigators prefer not to speculate about without evidence. The entry into apartment 4B at 6:07 a.m. was planned as a routine warrant execution. The discovery of the command center at 6:09 a.m. transformed it into the beginning of a rescue operation. The coordinated raids at 11:47 a.m. freed 141 people. And the investigation that followed revealed a network that had hidden in plain sight for over 4 years, operating from a residential building where neighbors had no idea what was happening 2 floors above or below their own apartments. 1 warrant, 1 address, 1 suspect, 7 locations, 156 victims, 4 years of operation, and 1 bedroom filled with computers that documented everything.